Hello, Horus Heresy fans. Welcome to Heresy, the Horus Heresy talk show. In this episode, we're going to talk about 8 things that you need to consider when building an army for the Horus Heresy Age of Darkness. Now, these things that we're going to talk about, these are not necessarily things that you need to consider to have the best competitive army in your area. Don't take it like that, although it certainly is useful for that kind of thing. This, for me, are the things that you need to consider you want your army to be able to deal with in order to have a good game. Because for me, there isn't always a great experience if you turn up to play a game and your opponent's brought something they consider cool and you've brought something you consider cool and they're super mismatched and one of you just can't have a good game out of it. Right, and that also happens particularly when you got lots of new players, like is going to happen with the Horus Heresy now, who maybe don't know each other and don't know what they're bringing. So this is just some stuff to consider that is going to be quite common in the game, and you're going to want to think about how you deal with this on the table in order to make sure your games are good. Okay, so let's speak about these 8 things. So firstly, Space Marines. Now, Space Marines historically in a lot of Warhammer games has not always been a thing that you really needed to worry about because they've never necessarily been very good in a lot of previous editions of the game. And putting lots of Space Marines on the table has not necessarily ever been a good tactic, and you'd more often see elite units and specialist units and people finding all sorts of different ways not to actually have to buy tactical Marines in lots of games. And you saw this in Horus Heresy 1 when you look at back at lists as well. Lots of people would take Pride of the Legion or other Right to War that would replace their compulsory troop choices with things that aren't Marines. But now, Marines have gotten a lot better. So 100 points now gets you 10 Marines, and that's 10 bodies with bolters. They don't actively do a lot necessarily unless they're shooting at other Marines. But they are quite tough to kill because the number of AP3 weapons in the game, or weapons that can penetrate Marine armor, has gone down hugely. The expense of those weapons is real. And also as well, the Marines have now got Feel No Pain 6 from Heart of the Legion when they're near an objective as well. They're just generally cheap. And also as well, when we dip into other Marine units, assault units, heavy support units, that kind of stuff, they've also gotten cheaper. So heavy support units, for example, can take a las cannon for 10 points now. So for just 150 points, you can have 5 guys with 5 las cannons, which is also really, really good. So there's lots of reasons for people to put Space Marines on the table now, and it's cool. It's the kind of thing you want to see in the Horus Heresy. If someone comes along and puts 100 or more Space Marines on the table, that's great. That's kind of like a thing we've always wanted to see in Warhammer games, and now it's also a good tactic as well, is just bringing lots of Space Marines, whatever you equip them with, whether you got special weapon squads with plasma guns, you got some veterans, you've got Recon Marines with Nemesis bolters, Seeker squads, tactical squads, heavy support squads. They're all great, and an army full of them will be great. And if you're going to be bringing your armies to the table, you might well bring a lot of guns ready to kill all the big, scary, flashy tanks and dreadnoughts and that kind of stuff in the Horus Heresy. If someone just puts a lot of Space Marines down, you might have a hard time dealing with them. So you are going to want to bring a way to deal with that. Now, effective high rate of fire AP3 weapons are actually quite few and far between. So bring them when you can. Obviously, some specialist units like Dark Angels Interemptors are very good at killing Space Marines, but those are also quite rare as well. One good way to kill lots of Marines at a time is Assault. Just a specialised Assault unit. Doesn't have to kill that many Marines, but it wins the Assault, makes them fall back, sweeps them off the board, that kind of thing as well. But you've got to have a way to make sure that armies with lots of guys who can certainly just hold objectives all day and just beat you into the ground is something you can deal with. Number 2, kind of related, Apothecars. Apothecars are going to be everywhere, particularly in armies for people who do like putting Marines on the board. They're cheap. You can get lots of them in a Force Org slot. Feel No Pain is really good, and they give the unit another body ultimately as well for squads like heavy weapon squads when they just want to lose a guy that hasn't got a las cannon. So putting Apothecaries in squads is going to be a big deal. Everybody's going to be doing it. You can see that they're like permanently sold out on Forge World right now as well. They came back into stock for a day and then they went out again. So Apothecaries are going to be a big deal. Also as well, just weapons in squads. As ever, you get your sergeants with your artificer armor, but you also get your sergeants just with power weapons and that kind of stuff for assault. So it's also good to be able to deal with that at the same time. Likewise, librarians are going to be really good really popular. Lots of different kinds, actually, of consoles are all really good in the game at the minute, and you are going to want a way of dealing with them without having to necessarily destroy their entire squad, although that is an option too. So the obvious answer to this is snipers. Anything with the sniper rule, anything with the precision shots rule. So seekers or scouts or recon squads or veterans with nemesis bolters are really good as well, and they can stay really far at the back of the battlefield as well and keep themselves safe while they're shooting things too. They're good options for dealing with this. So it's not that you necessarily have to do this. Oh, also the sniper as well, the sniper console as well is also very good, particularly at dealing with the one wound versions of these models like Apothecars, not so much at dealing with the characters, but you certainly, the Vigilator, you certainly want to consider bringing some way to deal with these. It's something you could not deal with, but you will make yourself much better at killing all these things if you're just able to bring at least maybe one squad, spend 100 points on some scouts, and have a way to kill some Apothecaries, and add some variation to your army at the same time. So, number 3, things with 2+ saving throws, especially when they've also got an invuln as well. So really, for the most part, we're talking about Terminators and Dreadnoughts. They're super good now, with generally the lack of ways to kill them and the fact that they are cheaper and all the Terminators are 2 wounds and the Dreadnoughts aren't vehicles anymore. They're just really hard to kill, and if you've got any kind of maths head, you will have already thought this through and looked at the numbers, and just you look at it and you just think there's no real good way to kill these. It's very difficult. So really the best thing to kill Terminators with is las cannons, actually, because they go through the 2+ save, they instant death them to get around the 2 wounds, and they do get their invuln against that though as well, which, because Terminators aren't that expensive, still makes them quite efficient. And if you're shooting them with las cannons, your las cannons aren't shooting something else. Likewise, plasma guns are pretty good at it, although they won't instant death them. Melter guns, any of the big kind of weapons aimed at killing vehicles are also good at killing Dreadnoughts and Terminators. So certainly those kind of weapons are really important now, and not just for killing the big vehicles as well. Terminators, the advantage is they're going to come to you. So if you like melter guns, and I do like melter guns, and you're going to have Terminators charging at you, which is going to happen a lot, you've got them melter guns to shoot them with as well. Some Terminators are even better. You know, you've got like Fire Drakes with a 3+ save, and they're very hard to instant death as well with most of the weapons that we would like to shoot them with, which makes Salamander's Fire Drakes very, very, very good in my opinion. But there's not an awful lot we can necessarily do about that other than pin them is an alternative way of dealing with some of these units. So if you can't kill them, or if you're struggling to kill them, or you want an alternative way, a way you can deal with them is just pinning them, right? And we've obviously got access to psychic powers like telepathy. We got access to some other things, again, like the Vigilator, who's a sniper, who's also got Shell Shock 1 for his pinning as well. Any of those kind of things you can bring to try and pin these super elite units rather than bother and trying to kill them is also a great way of dealing with them. And lastly, you can also just tar pit them. So if you're not familiar with the term, it means just give them something to distract them, right? Like a unit of 10 Space Marines is really good. You know, if you throw the 10 Space Marines into them in melee, or if you put them in the way so they have to charge them, because Terminators and Dreadnoughts aren't very fast at getting around these things, you can hold them up for a turn, and particularly if you've got a way to make those units fearless, or maybe if you're playing Word Bearers, for example, where the leadership can't go below 6, sometimes, if you're lucky, they might not kill the whole unit of Space Marines, and you might have a couple left, and you get like a couple of turns of holding up a unit of Terminators with just 10 men, which is also a good way of dealing with them as well. Okay, let's talk about armor 14 or 15 in the case of flare-shielded vehicles, pseudo 15 vehicles. This is another very big thing, very tough to kill, that you're going to want a way of dealing with. Now, especially because there is a Spartan in the Age of Darkness box, so everyone's going to have access to at least one of those, and people are going to buy spares and run multiple. We know there's a plastic Land Raider coming out as well. So these AV-14 vehicles, 14 all-round as well, no back armor for you to hit, maybe also flare-shielded. When you bring the Kratos into the equation, the Kratos, I should say, into the equation, which is coming out now, which is a super cool kit, you're going to have lots of these very big, multiple hull point, tough vehicles on the table soon. And you're going to want a way to kill them. Now, again, classic ways to kill these, standard ways to kill them, melter guns, las cannons. You've also got things like graviton guns, which are good at this as well. You're going to want to make sure you've got enough of those things to be able to deal with these things. Now, handily, those things also deal with Terminators and Dreadnoughts that we've just talked about as well, so you can see where the importance of getting some of these weapons into your army is if you want to have game, against these kind of things. Now, there is the argument that you could just ignore some of these vehicles to some extent as well. Like, although a Spartan is very, very tough, the Spartans only got 4 las cannon shots, maybe 6 las cannon shots. Now, and for its point cost, that's not actually a lot when you consider you can get that out of a bunch of Space Marines for 150 points, which is like, you know, under half to a third of the cost of a Spartan. So you could just let them trundle around the battlefield shooting their las cannons at you and occasionally ramming your guys. That's also a completely legit way to do it, as long as you've got another plan for how you're going to win the game whilst trying to ignore that Spartan. Next one, and this sort of ties back into the two we've just talked about, big special melee units, especially when they're in transports. So the elite Terminators and other similar units like Invictus Suzerain models that have got, you know, a 2-up save and a board and shield, that are also super elite in melee, so weapon skill 5 and generally some other abilities to go with that as well. They are very scary, and the difference between them and any other unit, even like a unit of Assault Space Marines or something like that, is night and day. And those units will kill your units all day long and never lose a combat, and you've got to have a way to deal with these kind of units, otherwise they're just going to chug their way through your army pretty much. One way of dealing with them is having your own super elite melee unit and having a big fight and seeing who wins, which is a completely legit way of doing it and is also super cool. Another way of doing it, as I mentioned earlier, is making sure you've got stuff to feed them just to keep them busy so they're not killing your super valuable units and that kind of stuff. Another way of doing it is trying to beat them in combat with characters. So if people are bringing those units and not giving them a character, your weaker units, but with a decent character included, could just beat them in combat and run them off is another way to do it. And again, as I mentioned before, pinning. Now, most of these units do tend to be stubborn and that kind of thing, but, you know, again, it's no defense against, you know, my favorite again, librarians with telepathy. So that's also another way of dealing with some of these super elite units. And some of these are particularly, to use a classic phrase, beardy. I think the Justarian Terminators are pretty crazy. I think the Dark Angels Paladins are pretty crazy as well, and they're not even very expensive for what they do for their points cost. So definitely don't be afraid to bring things like librarians to counter these units to make sure that you're not having your whole game overtaken just by a super cheesy unit of paladins. So off the topic of big things that are hard to kill, now onto some other things. Big shooty units are really good now because of reactions, right? So big shooter units can return fire if you try to shoot them, which at the least guarantees that they are doing some damage before they get killed. And generally big shooter units, if they're tough, like let's say it's a Dreadnought with 2 Gravis las cannons, you're going to be wanting to shoot that with something that's good as well. So your high value unit is going to be shooting the enemy high value unit and he's going to return fire. Now you don't want to give people free shots like that as much as you can. And likewise, the same applies to charging on Overwatch. So Overwatch is a full ballistic skill now. So if you want to charge, you know, 5 Space Marines with Volkite Culverins with one of your units, you might just find that they evaporate before they ever get there, or at least it's too painful to charge. And you are going to want some way of dealing with these reactions, because ultimately every reaction of one of these kinds is a free shot into your army. So again, pinning is such a great mechanic in this game, and it shouldn't be underestimated how important or impactful it is, because it counters a lot of the things in the game that you can't counter just by shooting or assaulting them, which is really cool actually. It's like an extra dimension to the game that didn't really exist before. Now, it can be quite hard to pin things. Most things will pass a pin and test on averages, even if you've given them like -1 leadership. So if you've got ways to influence that, which is one of the reasons that telepathy keeps coming up, because it comes with its own inbuilt ways to get around those leadership tests. If you've got ways to influence that, like maybe Shell Shock, maybe you're playing Night Lords, you know, whatever it is, you got ways to make that pinning better, so much the better. You might not always be able to stop these units doing reactions, but if you can stop it sometimes, you know, you're still handling the problem for your guys, and sometimes you only need to stop it once to get that critical charge or round the shooting off. You can also use smaller units as well to bait those reactions out. So, you know, if you've got a unit of Space Marines with bolters and you manage to get them to shoot a unit of Space Marines with multi-melters, for example, if your enemy wants to use as reaction to shoot your Space Marines, you're kind of okay with it, and then once the reaction's used, you can go and shoot that unit with something better. But if he doesn't use the reaction, your bolters are still going to kill a few guys with multi-melters as well. So you can maybe use some of your lower value units to try and bait the reactions out. And if your opponent doesn't react to those, when you shoot it with something else, by the time he does react, hopefully he's lost a few guys and his reaction's less effective. So you're not just going to want to pile all your points into these big, super elite, awesome units all the time, because it reduces the options you've got on the table, which is also great because it means that armies that are built with a bit of variation, which is what we want to encourage in the game, is also better as well, which is really cool. So number 7 thing that you're going to want to deal with, this one is deep strike or outflank, or just generally things that are very fast, but mostly we're talking about deep strike and outflank. So there's a lot of ways in the Horus Heresy to, deep strike onto the table. So you've got drop pod assault, you've got the subterranean assault, you've got outflank, you've got armies that can use outflank without needing a right of war as well. You've just got things that do outflank, like javelins, which are really good and stuff as well. And lots of them units are going to come on from the side of the table or just drop straight into your face and do a lot of damage. And there's lots of units in the game that can really do an awful lot when they just turn up and do all their stuff in your turn. Whether that's super elite melee units charging you, whether it's things with plasma guns or other special weapons, sort of just turning up and killing a bunch of your stuff. You're going to want a way to deal with that, because it's not really much fun having someone put the models down, take all your stuff off. And so, you want to actually interact, and the Horus Heresy lets us interact in this new edition of the game, which is great. So firstly, we've got the interceptor reaction, which is really good. So when things turn up from one of these special deployments, you can shoot them. Again, you want to take advantage of the things I'm saying we need to deal with. You're going to want to have some good shooting units. If you've got a unit of 10 Space Marines with las cannons, and someone deploys a bunch of Terminators onto the board from deep strike, let's say, right of the Crimson... Guard of the Crimson King or something like that, you shoot them with 10 las cannons, you're in the money. So making sure that you've got something that's good at using things like Interceptor is good. You've also got things like Deredio Dreadnoughts or Contemptor Dreadnoughts with the Helical Targeting Array, which gives you free Interceptor reactions as well. So in theory, you could have multiple Interceptors when people are moving this stuff on. Those things also let you deal with flyers as well, which is also another good thing. And movement phase reactions as well in general as well. So another way to deal with this stuff is when people turn out with their deep strike, they scatter a little bit. You use a movement phase reaction. Maybe you move out of plasma gun rapid fire range. Or maybe you move out of armor bane range for multi-melters, or maybe you move out of charge range, or at least make the charge harder. Movement phase reactions are also good, and again, if your army's got a way to get multiple, that could be the way that you deal with people doing this stuff. There's also other options as well. Something I really like is the Master of Signals. So he's got something called a Vox Disruptor Array, and that means when people land, you've got you roll a dice on a 1, 2, or 3 as opposed to just a 1 normally. The landing's disordered and you get to deploy the other person's units, which is devastating a lot of the time. Another way you can force that to happen, if you are playing an army with lots of units on the board, if someone scatters to within 1 inch of you, you get to move their units around and deploy their units a little bit. So the more stuff you've got on the board, the more likelihood when someone deep strikes that it's going to mishap and you're going to be able to deploy their stuff as well. So lots of ways around this one, but you are going to want to have a way or have thought about how you deal with deep strikey style armies to make sure you don't just have a really poor game when someone brings one of these. And, these kind of armies are cool as well, so it's not wrong of people to bring a drop pod army. They look awesome, they match all the lore that we always read about Space Marines, but just make sure you've got the stuff to make it a game. And the last thing I'm going to talk about, I've mentioned it already, is pinning. So pinning is very strong, and particularly pinning people and using telepathy is very strong as well. Thousand Sons have got ways to give -1 leadership when they're shooting things, and if you combine that with some shell shock weapons, that can be pinning. Iron Warriors can make all of the bolters in their army pinning, and if they play lots of Marines, they could be dropping pinning tests all over your army and pinning lots of units. Pinning is super powerful because it just stops you doing so much stuff. It takes the unit out of the game for a turn, effectively, which can be a big deal. If someone can take a few of your key units out of the game and then focus on fighting the other ones, it makes a huge difference. Pinning is very, very good. So anything you can do to make pinning less effective against your army is good. So obviously examples of this generally include anything that makes your leadership higher, any way you've got of getting higher leadership, whether that's from characters or from Primarch abilities or from giving your units fearless to negate leadership negatives, because most of them pin and tests aren't generally very effective without leadership negatives. So, one way of dealing with it is to actually just make sure you can ignore the negatives as well, or just using generally high leadership units. So, you can get plenty of units that are like full 9 rather than just a sergeant's 9 and that kind of stuff as well. I'm also going to mention something I haven't seen many people talk about either, the Psychic HUD. The Psychic HUD you can take on a Librarian for 15 points, and it gives everybody within range -2 leadership on the test, which is really good when you're looking at people using this telepathy psychic power on your guys as well. So there you go. So that's it. 8 different things that you should consider when building your army. If you think about these things while you're building an army, you're not going to go far wrong with having something that's effective on the tabletop and making sure you don't have any of those really dull games where someone brings something and you think, I just didn't think about that, I've got no way of beating it, and you end up having a bit of a wasted game. Alternatively, if that's not your thing, that's also fine. If you only care about theme, you don't care about any of this stuff at all, just ignore this episode completely. Maybe it's not for you. But, either way, I think you have better games when you think about these kind of things, at least a little bit. It doesn't have to make every choice for you, but think about these things at least a little bit when you're making your armies for the Horus Heresy and when you're making your purchases that you're undoubtedly making now to be able to play this new edition. So thank you very much for listening. I would really appreciate a like and a subscribe to the video. And if you've got any comments or any discussions you'd like to have or anything like that about this episode, please do drop me a comment. And I'm going to leave you with a quote, which I believe is from Alfarius. War is simply the galaxy's hygiene. Bye-bye.